Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation on the draft Northwest Climate Change Report from the National Climate Assessment. My name is David Pott, Climate Change Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service's Pacific Region based here in Portland, Oregon. I'll be emceeing today's webinar on behalf of C3, the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Collaboration, which is a federal interagency group of climate change scientists, coordinators, and others. Let me just introduce Amy Snover. Dr. Snover is the director of the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington College of the Environment. And I would encourage everyone to visit the Climate Impacts Group's website if you haven't already done so. It's just a great site with lots of material and very accessible content. Dr. Snover serves as a co-convening lead author on this draft report with Dr. Phil Mote from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. And I would like to welcome Amy and thank you in advance for presenting today.
Thank you, David and C3 for the opportunity to present here, and thank you to all of my faceless friends out there who are signed up to listen. I appreciate your interest. David asked me to give an overview of the National Climate Assessment Draft Report that was released in mid-January and is currently out for public comment. And so what I want to do in our time together today is give you a little bit of background into the National Climate Assessment itself, just so you have the context of where this Northwest effort fits. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour through some of the national key findings, but really spend most of the time focusing on what the material is in the chapter on the Northwest. I'm going to point you to some additional resources that I think may be useful, the technical inputs developed for the report, and an upcoming longer version for the Northwest, and then tell you how to make comments and tell you about a town hall that's going on next week. Let's begin with the background, objectives, inputs, outputs, and timeline for the National Climate Assessment. So the National Climate Assessment is being done under the auspices of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which has a mandate to develop and coordinate a comprehensive and integrated research program for the United States that will assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of climate change. And you can see the logos of the many federal agencies that are involved in this U.S. Global Change Research Program. So as part of this act, it was established that not less frequently than every 4 years, an assessment shall be prepared that integrates, evaluates, and interprets the findings of the U.S. GCRP program and other research in the nation, analyzing the effects of global change on various sectors of importance, and projects major trends for the next 25 to 100 years. So the national climate assessments that have been produced so far are shown here. There was one in 2000 and one in 2009, and they both had sort of foundational documents that looked across the nation as a whole, and then more specific regional and sectoral reports. But to give you a sense of scale, the 2009 report had about 4 pages on the Northwest, which are quite useful, but not as detailed as one might think from the large size of the document. It's really intended to do a synthesis and overview of the nation as a whole, with the sector and region specific as appropriate. So since 2009, that was the last assessment, and now there is a process gearing up, actually in full swing, to develop the next national climate assessment. And this is a little diagram from the assessment office of the process that they're going through. So if you start on the left, there is technical input provided by federal agencies, by the Federal Advisory Committee team members who are informing and driving the assessment process, and from the general public. And there's a large variety of technical inputs that were delivered to the author teams for each chapter. I'm going to get into the details of what the different chapters are about. And so the chapter author teams are sort of independent teams linked to the Federal Advisory Committee that then provide their chapter reports to be assimilated into an overall draft report for the nation. And that was what was released on January 14th. So right now, we are in this period of public and expert review where the report is out. I'll show you how to submit your comments at the end. And until April, the comments are being received. Then in the rest of the spring and summer, the chapter authors will be revising and responding to those comments. And then through fall and early winter, there's the review and finalization by the Federal Advisory Committee, the agencies, the White House review, for ultimate release in early 2014. That gives you a sense of where we are and where we're going. So what's in this report? This is a list of the major content items for the 2013, which actually should now be the 2014 report, because it just, I think, is now intended to be released early in 2014. In addition to an introduction and executive summary, there's chapters on the scientific basis for climate change, sort of climate science aspect of it. There are sectors and sectoral crosscut chapters, regions, and biogeographical crosscut chapters. There are chapters on decision support, on mitigation, on adaptation, on the research agenda for climate change science, and on the sustained assessment process that the National Climate Assessment is establishing. So what I'm talking about today is a report that's being prepared, but this is in the context of a much broader effort to develop a sustained and ongoing inclusive assessment process. So there'll be a little insight into how that might shape up in this report as well. So this is going to be released as an ebook, the long version, around 400 pages, and then a 50-page printed synthesis document. And it's a long list of chapters. It's about 30 chapters, so it still needs to be rather concise for each chapter. So to give you, I want to give you the details on what the sectors and regions are that are being covered. So there are specific chapters, individual chapters on these sectors: water, energy, transportation, agriculture, forestry, ecosystems and biodiversity, and human health. Then there are some additional cross-cutting sectoral chapters that look at the intersections and issues that's a good word, issues that are associated with these interacting sectors: water, energy, and land use, urban infrastructure vulnerability, impacts of climate change on tribal, indigenous, and native lands and resources, land use and land cover changes, and rural communities, and impacts on biogeographical cycles. Here are the regions. For each one of these regions, there is a separate chapter. And there are some biogeographical crosscuts, one chapter on oceans and marine resources, and one chapter on coastal zone development and ecosystems. So a coastal chapter and an ocean chapter in addition to those regional chapters. So let me give you a quick fly through the national key findings, and this is just going to be incredibly fast because I think our main interest here is on the Northwest chapter findings, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of high-level messages that are being produced for the national scale. And you'll see on the slides that there's quite a bit of underlying substantiating information provided for each of these that I don't have time to go through. So key finding number one. Global climate is changing. This is apparent across the U.S. in a wide range of observations. The climate change of the past 50 years is due primarily to human activities, predominantly the burning of fossil fuels. Number two, some extreme weather and climate events have increased in recent decades. and there is new and stronger evidence that many of these increases are related to human activities. The climate is changing, and we can see some human influence there. Human-induced climate change is projected to continue and accelerate significantly if emissions of heat-trapping gases continue to increase. So this is setting the overall stage for what we understand about what's changed already in the climate and the path we're on as a nation. Impacts related to climate change are already evident in many sectors and are expected to become increasingly challenging throughout the century and beyond. There's a couple neat maps here showing observed changes in frost-free season and changes in heavy precip, but there's lots of other examples of observed changes. Climate change threatens human health and well-being in many ways through a variety of impact pathways that many of us are familiar with. Infrastructure across the U.S. is being adversely affected by phenomena that are associated with climate change. So we are seeing impact on infrastructure by similar phenomena, including sea level rise, storm surge, heavy downpours, and extreme heat. Reliability of water supplies is being reduced by climate change in a variety of ways that affect ecosystems and livelihoods in many regions. And you'll see as we get into the Northwest chapter, of course, the effects on the hydrologic cycle are a main driver of impact here. Adverse impacts to crops and livestock over the next 100 years are expected, despite shorter-term resilience. Natural ecosystems are being directly affected by climate change, and as a result, their capacity to moderate the consequences of disturbance is being diminished. And finally, I think this is the final key finding at the national summary: life in the oceans is changing as ocean waters become warmer and more acidic. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Oops, I forgot there's a couple more. Planning for adaptation and mitigation activities is increasing, but progress with implementation is limited. And this is the theme we see in the Northwest as well, that impact assessment and planning is, there's quite a bit of activity moving in that direction, but we have far fewer examples of implementation of those. So let's get into the meat of the Northwest chapter.
Hey, Amy.
Yes.
This is David. I've gotten a couple of comments from folks that your audio is a little choppy.
Oh, goodness.
And I don't know if there's anything you can do on your end to prove that.
Okay, I'm going to, I have a little headset that I'm using, and I will put it closer to my mouth.
Okay.
And if that is a problem, if this doesn't solve the problem, just break in, and I'll pick up and use the receiver instead.
The comments are so far much better.
Okay, gosh, sorry about that, everyone. I'm glad you interrupted. And again, interrupt again if it's problematic, because I can switch to the phone receiver. Okay. So the Northwest chapter has been written by a variety of authors. As David mentioned, Phil Mote at OSU and I are the co-convening lead authors. And then we have a host of other individuals that are listed here. These are the lead authors, and then there is actually quite a long list of people who have contributed and supported us in this effort, which I did not have time to assemble a complete list, but I wanted to give a shout out to Megan Dalton, who works with Phil, who's done a lot of our support on this, and then I needed to mention Rob Norheim in my group because he made most of the maps that I'll be showing. So the charge to us, this is stepping back a little bit again, just to give you some context, is to develop a scientific assessment of existing knowledge. So by this, we mean a policy-relevant synthesis of existing knowledge from a wide range of inputs. Not a review, but an assessment of knowledge. We need to use a wide variety of inputs. As I mentioned, there's a technical input submission process. We looked at peer-reviewed literature, agency reports, gray literature, data sets, very many different inputs, all that had to meet the standards of the Data Quality Act. Big question we were asking is what is new since the 2009 assessment? The goal of this assessment overall is to target a diversity of audiences, including Congress, local, regional, and state decision makers, as well as the public. Our research and writing needed to prepare for a layered approach to information delivery. Layered is my word, not the National Assessment's word, but by this I mean even though we're writing a short 8-page synopsis, the assessment is working really hard to make sure that the underlying data and information that informed all of the chapters is made available. So we had to pay attention to that. And we needed to focus on impacts that matter. When you're limited to 8 pages, you have to think about what's going to be in there and what's not. So we were instructed to use a risk and vulnerability lens to identify some of the key impacts to focus on. So when you think about risk, the risk we might experience from these different climate impacts, we need to think about the 2 components of risk, the likelihood of something occurring and the consequence of its occurrence. And so as we developed the Northwest chapter, we took this risk framing approach that I outlined here, where we identified the regional impacts of climate change, and that's a very long list that a lot of you are very familiar with. Then we looked through the regional consequences of those impacts. When those impacts happen, what would the consequences be for regional human health, regional economy, regional infrastructure, and regional natural systems? And we focused the chapter on the impacts with the highest consequence for the region and on sectors of significant economic importance for the region. So, and you'll see what those were in a moment when I get to the key messages. So for each key area, then we described the observed and projected changes in that area, the consequences and likelihoods of those projected changes. And we spent some time discussing adaptive capacity and implications for vulnerability. So here are the 4 key messages. Sorry, this is kind of a text-heavy, ugly slide, but they're broken down much nicer in the subsequent slides. But I just want to review them here so we have them in the front of our minds. Changes in the timing of stream flow related to changing snowmelt are already observed and will continue, reducing the supply of water for many competing demands and causing far-reaching ecological and socioeconomic consequences. The next one's on the coastal zone. In the coastal zone, the effects of erosion, inundation, and threats to infrastructure and habitat, and increasing ocean acidity collectively pose a major threat to the region. The combined impact of increasing wildfire, insect outbreaks, and diseases is virtually certain to cause additional forest mortality by the 2040s, as well as long-term transformation of forest landscapes. Almost complete loss of subalpine forest is expected by the 2080s. And finally, while the agriculture sector's technical ability to adapt to changing conditions can offset some of the adverse impacts of a changing climate, there remain critical sector-specific concerns with respect to costs of adaptation, development of more climate-resilient technologies and management, and availability and timing of water. So the first 3 were the major vulnerabilities identified in this risk framing approach. And then agriculture is important as a major component of the region's economy. So quick review on the findings on observed climate change. The Northwest has been observed to have warmed 1.5 degrees over the past century. Trends in precipitation have been observed to be very variable. They vary among locations, seasons, and time periods of analysis. But their general long-term increases in the spring, and most studies indicate increased extreme precip or heavy downpours as in the rest of the country. It's important to note that these and other climate trends that are driving the changes discussed in the chapter include contributions from both human influences and natural climate variability. And that's a real theme that's important as we think about how to move forward with these projections in regional decision-making. So that was observed. I think I said observed and projected. Here's the projected. So continued warming of about 3.5 to 9.5 degrees by the end of the century, and this is dependent on emission scenario, of course. This range of projections uses emission scenarios that decline over time as well as ones that increase throughout the century. Largest warming projected in summer, and a range of changes projected for annual precipitation from decreases to increases annually, but seasonally, there are much more consistent decreases projected for summer precipitation, as much as 30% by the end of the century for the scenarios in which emissions continue to rise. So focusing on the water-related challenges encapsulated in key message number 1. Let me show you some of the things we're presenting. The fraction, so reduced, this is a figure from the draft report showing observed shifts in stream flow timing. These reduced June flows in many northwest snow-fed rivers is a signature of warming in basins that have significant snowmelt contribution. You can see here that the fraction of annual flow that's arriving in June increased slightly in the rain-dominated coastal basins and decreased in the mixed rain and snow basins and the snowmelt-dominated basins in the second half of the last century. So this June is during this high flow period for many northwest river basins, so decreases in these summer flows can make it more difficult to meet a variety of competing and human and natural demands for water. So these are observed shifts, and then we have the projected changes in timing of stream flows. This is a figure that will probably be familiar to many of you, looking at changes, projected changes in the hydrograph, in this case for the Yakima Basin in Washington, but this is a transient sort of mid-elevation watershed that receives both rain and snow in the wintertime. So these kinds of rivers will see increased winter flows, earlier spring flows, and decreased summer flows in a warming climate. And so again, these are the projections for the transient basins, and it's a good reminder for us that hydrologic response to climate change varies by type of watershed. And so looking at the impacts across the region, we need to be sub-regionally specific when we're thinking about what kind of watershed we're looking in. But focusing on that the summer low flow period, what we show here are projected changes in summer low flow in the 2040s under that continued increased emission scenario, A1B. So where you have brown, you have up to fairly significant decreases in the summer low flows. So this is the 2040s compared to baseline, basically 20th century, 1915 to 2006. And in all modeling studies, I think essentially all, near 100% likelihood, reductions in summer flow will occur by 2050 in basins with significant snowmelt. So these reductions will combine with increases in demand for power, electric power demand for cooling, and increases in water demand by vegetation. This is evaporative demand from crops and forests to require trade-offs among objectives of the whole system of water use in the region. So one example we show of that is from a Payne et al. Study that reductions in hydropower production of as much as 20% by the 2080s could be required to preserve in-stream flow targets for fish in the Columbia River Basin. This is a synopsis of some of the implications that we highlight of these changes, hydrologic changes for freshwater fish species. So we have the increased stress of rising temperatures to increase disease or mortality for salmon, especially in the interior Columbia and Snake River basins, although there may be locally specific places where streams are less sensitive to this warming because they're buffered by snowmelt or groundwater. There have been recent studies showing how suitable habitat for the 4 trout species of the interior western U.S. is projected to decline almost 50% by the 2080s, and we have other observed and projected changes of importance. So when we think about adaptability and vulnerability of these different systems in the Northwest that are sensitive to or dependent on water, what we see is a really strong, really varying ability to adapt managed water resources to climate changes. And it depends, the ability to adapt really depends on the nature of existing infrastructure, supply allocation, institutional arrangements, management, flexibility, and responsiveness to changing conditions. So this results in very differential vulnerability across the region. And this is another theme of the chapter that while we get one story by looking across the region in an aggregate, as we are expected to for a national assessment, we really, the useful and detailed information is when we take a sub-regional approach and look at specific places to specific characteristics to assess impacts and vulnerability. And the adaptive capacity of freshwater ecosystems is, of course, affected by the type of adaptation that happens in a managed system, or for in more natural streams, it may depend on species' ability to change behavior or take advantage of cold water refugia. Let's take a little look at coastal vulnerabilities. There are multiple drivers, of course, in the coastal zone that are important to focus on. In addition to sea level rise, there have been observed and there are projected increases in coastal sea surface temperatures. But in general, our coastal marine environment is characterized by very highly variable physical and ecological conditions. And one thing that's been highlighted recently in the region is the increasing but highly variable acidity. So there's multiple drivers, one of which we focus on here is the projected sea level rise for the region from the recent NRC report on West Coast sea level rise. So this is a new analysis, or recent analysis last year, that considered a wide range of emission scenarios and accounted for a wide range of factors that affect local relative sea level rise. So we have a range of projections for 45 degrees north, which is about Newport, Oregon, using the methodology that the NRC report used. And we point out in the chapter that it is impossible to assign likelihood to any one possible trajectory of sea level rise at this time. And so a reasonable risk assessment that could be used to inform local adaptation planning would consider multiple scenarios within this full range of possible outcomes. There are many consequences of these impacts, these different climate change related changes for our coastal environment, some of which are highlighted here. We know we may expect declining quality and extent of many coastal wetlands, tidal flats, and beaches. There's over 140,000 acres of coastal lands within 3 1/3 feet elevation of high tide, which will be more frequently inundated as the sea level rise shown in the last slide continues. There are too numerous to enumerate studies of the diverse and widespread ecological impacts in the coastal area, but we point out the harm to shorebirds and forage fish by habitat loss, the increasing understanding of the implications of ocean acidification for both culturally and commercially significant marine species, and other impacts that are listed here. So those are the various ways in which our natural coastal ecosystems will be affected by these multiple drivers, but we also note the many ways in which erosion, inundation, and flooding will threaten our coastal infrastructure and communities. And since 2009, there have been interesting analyses of climate impacts on public and private property along the coast, including transportation and utility infrastructure, including wastewater treatment plants and stormwater outfalls, ferry terminals, and other coastal road and rail transportation. The coastal transportation, especially in Puget Sound, looks to be the most vulnerable from these rising seas. But to give you a sense of the kinds of analyses that have been occurring since 2009, we highlight a map here from the city of Seattle looking at the implications of the sea level increases and changing flood risks for the city. So this is a map of downtown Seattle under 3 scenarios of sea level rise, and it's indicating areas that are currently below sea level during high tide and therefore at risk of flooding or inundation. So these are within the ranges projected for the Northwest by that NRC panel report. The highest level here incorporates the compounding effect of storm surge. So this is an indication of the type of adaptation efforts that are underway throughout the region. In addition to Seattle, of course, there's other places like Olympia, Washington, Nesco, and Oregon that have mapped these kinds of risks from sea level rise and other factors. As we look then about thinking about the adaptability of coastal ecosystems to these projected climate changes, we see that in many cases the human activities have already increased the vulnerability of our coastal ecosystems. This is by degrading and eliminating habitat, or by building structures that, in addition to our natural bluffs, thwart the inland movement of many remaining habitats. So we know in Puget Sound, for example, about 1/3 of the shoreline has already been modified by seawalls, bulkheads, and other structures. And as we look forward, again, our response to erosion and sea level rise, the types of coastal hardening or green infrastructure projects that we undertake will largely determine the viability of many shallow water and estuarine ecosystems. I wanted to give a shout out to the recent Nisqually River Restoration Project. This is an interesting example of the kinds of considerations that climate change can bring to a restoration effort. So after about a century of isolation behind dikes, much of the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge was reconnected in 2009 with tidal flow by removal of a major dike and restoration of over 700 acres. So this had the effect of reconnecting many miles of historical channels and floodplains with Puget Sound. And when a new exterior dike was constructed to protect freshwater wetland habitat for migratory birds from tidal inundation and future sea level rise. So these changes, combined with an expansion of the authorized refuge boundaries, sort of upstream, uphill expansion, and these ongoing acquisitions that are intended to expand the refuge, will enhance the refuge's ability to provide diverse habitats despite the ongoing rising sea level and increasing river floods that are projected for Puget Sound. Let's look a little bit at the forest impacts that we discuss. The key message, again, is really that disturbance, wildfire, insect outbreaks, and diseases combined are going to cause additional forest mortality and really long-term transformation of the forested landscapes in the Northwest. Many of these impacts are going to be driven by water deficits, which increase tree stress and mortality, increase tree vulnerability to insects, as well as fuel flammability. And it's these cumulative effects of disturbance and possibly the interactions between insects and fires that will cause the greatest changes in Northwest forests. So here's a figure from the report that shows both observed and projected changes in Northwest forests. So the top map shows areas that were recently burned or affected by insects or disease. We know that higher temperatures and drought stress are contributing to outbreaks of mountain pine beetle that increase pine mortality in our drier forests. So here we have fire area, recent fire area, and insect and disease area for the late 20th century. In the middle, it shows the large increases in area burned by wildfire that are projected for much of the Northwest. These projections are associated with 2.2 degree Fahrenheit global warming, so less than what is projected for the end of the century under all scenarios, including, so this is looking at a 2.2 degree warming with the associated precipitation changes. And then in the bottom caption, we look at projected changes in the probability of mountain pine beetle climatic suitability. And this is comparing the first 30 years of this century to the last 30 years. So 2001 to 2030 compared to 1971 to 2000. So the brown is showing you areas where pine beetles are projected to increase in the future, and green where pine beetles are expected to decrease in the future. And this is resulting from these changes in the probability of survival, resulting from the climate-dependent factors that are important in beetle population success, including cold tolerance, spring precipitation, and seasonal heat accumulation. I'm going to skip through that one and go right to adaptability and vulnerability. Again, as we look at current adaptability of Northwest forested landscapes to these projected changes, we see that the ability to prepare for these changes really varies with land ownership and management priorities, what kind of tools people have available to them on their lands really are a factor of the management priorities and land ownership mission. So there are adaptation actions that can decrease forest vulnerability, the kinds of vulnerabilities we've identified here, but none is appropriate across all of our region's diverse climate threats, land use histories, and management objectives. So for example, surface and canopy thinning can reduce the effects of high severity fire in areas that were previously low severity systems, like the drier eastern Cascade forests, but these may be ineffective in the forests that have been historically high severity, like the western Cascades, Olympics, and some subalpine forests. So again, the message is that we have the tools and they've been tested or studied in various locations, but they are none of them is appropriate across the entire region. Brief comment on agriculture here, and this is a different kind of key message than for the other sectors, because the indication here is that this sector may be best able to adapt to these changing conditions. And this is a result of the agricultural sector's existing need to adapt to climate variations from place to place and time to time. But there remain some critical sector-specific concerns here with respect to the costs of adaptation and availability and timing of water in particular. So again, many of the changes here that are of concern are driven by the reduced availability of irrigation water that's projected for snowmelt-fed basins, with the increased risk of irrigation shortages in particular. There are other impacts of climate change for agriculture driven by the higher average temperatures and hot weather episodes that would reduce yields of wheat and other cereals, even in irrigated areas. In many of the impacts of climate change on the agricultural sector, many of the crops will benefit from a longer growing season and or the higher atmospheric CO2, at least for a few decades. The longer term consequences are less certain, as warming may overtake the benefits of CO2 fertilization. But to give you a sense of that, if you look at fully irrigated apple production, it would be projected to actually increase in Washington state over this next century because of the offsetting effect of CO2 fertilization. When we look at the economic consequences of these changes for Northwest agriculture overall, it's going to be influenced largely by input and output prices driven by global economic conditions, as well as by regional and local changes in productivity. I've already mentioned that of these 4 areas we've discussed, agriculture may be most adaptable because it's already responding to these annual climate variations. In addition to those key messages, I just wanted to point out for you a couple of additional cross-cutting findings. One of the questions I posed at the beginning was, what's new since 2009? And what we can say is that the continuing research that we reviewed for the assessment really largely confirms previous understanding about major impacts of climate change for the region, in particular these changes to the hydrologic cycle and the way they flow through and connect the other impact areas. But this ongoing research has been adding location and sector-specific detail that I think is really important for us to understand the regional texture and to think about what adaptation options might be. So we have some new areas of concern, like ocean acidification, that have arisen since the last national assessment, weren't even included in it. I also wanted to note that we had an economist on our lead author team, Susan Capalbo from Oregon State University, and we were really intent on moving our discussion much further towards an evaluation of some of the economic consequences of these projected changes. Those have really not been quantified in nearly the detail as the other impacts of the assessment. So I think that's really ripe for additional future work now. And as we look across the region to sort of evaluate existing adaptation efforts, we can see many going on in different sectors, in different places, but I think we would not yet say they're widespread or ubiquitous. So the next couple things I want to talk to you about are very short, so I'll just give you a quick look at these. I wanted to mention that in addition to the writing of these chapters, there's that are now out for review, there's a wealth of technical inputs that were prepared for the National Climate Assessment. So there are new regional climate histories, there are new sea level rise scenarios, but especially there were in-depth foundational assessments for many regions and sectors. There were agency-led, sector-specific and region-specific reports that I would encourage you to take a look at. There are some websites presented here that really let you go into much more detail about what they're much longer syntheses of existing knowledge around climate impacts. And then through this technical input process that the National Climate Assessment led, they also received information about individual papers and reports and literature compilations and regionally specific data sets that were all used in the development of these chapters, and I think will be really useful resources going forward because they allow you to get much more detail than we were able to do in the report. But speaking of additional detail, we are in the process of developing the long version of our Northwest chapter as a Northwest Regional Climate Change Report that will be published by Island Press later this year. And it covers the main areas that we covered in the National Assessment chapter, as well as some additional ones that we had not been able to focus on to the extent we wanted. This gives you a sense of what we're focusing on and who some of the contributors are. Again, there's a very long list of contributors. This is in the final stages of copy editing and review, and will go to the press shortly, again, for publication and distribution later this year. Two more quick announcements. There is a town hall hosted by the National Climate Assessment next week at Portland State University. There's been advertised that it's an opportunity to hear more detail about the assessment findings, but also to contribute to a discussion about strategies for ongoing assessment. And the town hall itself is full, but the meeting is going to be available by way of a Google Hangout, which I haven't done yet, but there's a URL here, and I'll show it later in the talk. There are also, the presentations will be streamed live as well as archived and made available later. So that's next Tuesday or anytime in the future with web access. Finally, it's review time for the National Assessment draft. Comments can be submitted, must be submitted online at this website, and then there will be a very detailed process of responding to all of the comments for all of the chapters. So there's some notes here that might be interesting to some people. Although you must identify yourself in the online form, when you submit your comments, your identity will not be provided to us as authors, so that we just get the comments and then respond to them. And it's really important, if you have any comments, that they have to go through this official online comment form, otherwise we won't get them. And you have until April 12th to do so. So I'm going to stop here and leave these URLs up to show you how to access the comment form, how to get more information about the town hall next week, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Amy. This is David Pott. I'll be emceeing the Q&A portion, and because we have over 120 people on the line, I think we'll go ahead and just take chat questions. It might be hard for me to unmute the correct line. So if you go back to your WebEx screen at the top there, if you scroll up to the top of your screen, you'll see a chat box, and you can ask a question that way. And Amy, I already have 2 questions lined up for you. The first question is a question about, did the assessment use emission scenarios with future emissions greater than those in the A1B scenario, which I assume may be more realistic to current emission scenarios that we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, so the assessment specifically chose 2 emission scenarios to frame the assessment. Those were B1 and A2. And so B1 is the one that increases and then decreases, or maybe it already decreases. So it's a very low emission scenario. And A2 is the highest at the end of the century, although in the intermediate, A1B is higher than that. So those were the framing scenarios chosen for the assessment. But for the individual chapters, we needed to use analyses that were existing, that had been done. And so you'll notice in the Northwest chapter, we have some findings that were tied to the A2 emission scenario, but most of the analysis in the region was based on B1 and A1B. So most of the reported results are based on those. But we also are explicit throughout the chapter as to which emission scenarios are underlying the different conclusions. So that should be clear to the reader.
And Amy, this might be a good time to mention the new global climate models and the downscaling for the region. So the team was not able to use those data. They weren't currently available. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Second question is from Louisa Evers, and we have a question about semi-arid areas that seem to be ignored by the report or not included in the report and even in the expanded report. And can you provide some comment on why the team chose that direction?
So first I can comment on the direction of this chapter, and I think it goes back to our risk framing approach, looking at the combination of the major drivers and the major sectors of interest to the region, but then looking through to aggregate consequences of projected impact in these areas to the region as a whole. Which of the consequences of climate change are likely to be most important when aggregated up to the regional scale of importance to human health, regional economy, infrastructure investments, and natural systems. And so that was the process we used by which the focus you see in the chapter, from which the focus you see in the chapter derives. That said, there are certainly, even amongst those and for all the other issues that we're not focused on, there are certainly very locally specific and locally, finer scale than the whole Northwest region, very important impacts. So time and space really precluded that for the draft chapter. And I would encourage you, if you think that this is, as all the comments you might make now, if you think this is a serious omission, then please provide that input through that National Assessment comment portal.
Okay, the next question, Amy, where would you suggest a county start to assess the potential combined flooding effects to sea level rise and potential increased runoff scenarios?
Well, let's see. I think that's a really neat question. It's fun to answer. I think a county should start in two places to do that. One is to identify the available existing projections of changes in stream flow for this particular rivers in the county, and any existing projections of changes in, mapped changes in sea level and shoreline effects. And there's a number, the Northwest has a wealth of local research groups that do this kind of analysis. And we're all, I think, represented on that author list. So I had a slide up there showing the Climate Impacts Group data portal because that was one of the data resources that we provided to the National Assessment through the technical input process, and underlies a lot of those the hydrologic change maps. So that is a resource that shows our existing knowledge of flooding changes. Then all of these research groups in the region can collaborate further to do more local projections of the combined effects of river flow changes and sea level rise. And for a good example of this, I would suggest looking at what the folks at the Skagit Climate Science Consortium are doing in the Skagit Basin in Washington, where they are trying to combine all these different drivers of flooding to understand the impacts for their basin. So that's the data side. What do we understand about how flooding and will look in the future? But the other side is really to take a hard look at what resources are exposed to potential flooding, what decisions are being made now that affect our future exposure to flooding, what kind of investment decisions, to start thinking from the point of view of managed resources and management objectives of the county, what could be at risk from flooding. And then you look at the intersection of those two things.
Thank you. For your next question, Amy, has anyone looked at the impacts to infrastructure adaptation activities in terms of capital costs and materials and work? I'm remembering, for example, I think the state of California has done that, and the state of Alaska. Has that occurred in the Northwest that you know of?
You're asking, David, not just about looking at
this is
exposure, but actually infrastructure investment and costs. Is that what you?
Yeah, a specific report on analysis on infrastructure adaptation activities.
So there are a number of analyses that are transportation related that look at the vulnerability of different aspects of Northwest transportation system to a changing climate. Washington State Department of Transportation did one on state-owned transportation, and one, I think it was actually a Washington Department of Transportation published report, again, done with Region 10 of the EPA, led by MacArthur, looked at climate change implications for transportation infrastructure throughout the region and into Alaska. Both of those studies look at how the projected impacts of climate change are likely to affect those transportation systems or segments, and start thinking about in some cases, their adaptability or the consequences of those changes for local communities. Transportation viability. Neither one of those gets to dollars, and in general, I'm not aware of any that do. I think that that's one of the big questions that people have now, is that now that we have a much better ability to project much more locally specific impacts, the next step is really thinking about how much those might cost, either in terms of actual impacts or in coping with them, preparing for them.
Okay. The next question has to do with seasonal stream flows. Are you accounting for the interaction of dams on seasonal stream flow distribution, especially under the future climate change scenarios?
So the figures that I showed were for naturalized flow. So those are assuming, for the sake of the presentation there, removing the effects of the dam. So it shows the timing of stream flow in that Yakima case as it would be in a natural system. There are numerous analyses. So, of course, that's a really important question, because if you want to get to impacts to a water user or water use in a managed system, you need to know what this water availability looks like after the action of the dams, not before. So there are numerous examples of that analysis being done in the Yakima, in the Puget Sound area, and others. The specific results I showed were for naturalized flows to show the changes projected for the underlying hydrologic nature of many Washington watersheds, and those in Oregon and Idaho as well.
Yeah, and I believe the Climate Impacts Group also helped the the Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power, and I'm trying to remember, that's called the River Managers Joint Operations Committee?
Yeah, the River Management Joint Operating Committee is Bonneville Power, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, looking at long-term planning implications of these changes in climate change.
Yeah, so if you search that on the web, you'll see a series of reports there that look at that.
Right. So there's numerous academic reports produced, reports from groups like ours, and then agencies are doing a lot of internal analysis for implications of these natural changes in natural water availability for their ultimate management objectives.
And Amy, we've reached 11 o'clock. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Yes.
Okay. We have another follow-up question on stream flow. Did the report consider how stream flow changes outside the Northwest, specifically in the Canadian portion of the Columbia Basin, would impact the region?
Oh, absolutely. The projected changes in hydrology and stream flow that we looked at in the report are from modeling studies that look at the entire Columbia Basin. And so even though I'm really reporting a U.S. Northwest-centric results, they look at the whole basin. And so what's interesting there is that the Canadian part of the basin tends to be higher and colder. So as it warms, that part of the basin has a higher percentage of snow. As it warms over time, we lose the low elevation snow, which disproportionately in the U.S. part of the basin. So there's interesting implications, and changes in stream flow timing are unique to specific subwatersheds within the region and affected by the input from the Canadian part of the basin.
Great. Okay, next question relates to species. The species covered in the report are all aquatic species, except for the insects mentioned in the forest section. Which terrestrial or cross-ecosystem species, such as mammals or amphibians, would you say are most vulnerable based on your report and findings?
That is a really great question that I am not the right person to answer. I think I'm going to have to just say I'm not the right person to answer that one. We did not look, as you can tell, in detail at impact on terrestrial species, and focusing more on sort of the underlying changes to habitat that may drive their ultimate climate change response. So I think where there's been recent success in identifying the climate change implications of climate change for those kinds of species has been where it's easy to make a clear connection between species viability and the climate-related changes that we can project with a high degree of confidence. So that sort of underlies the recent analysis looking at climate change impacts on the wolverine, for example, because their success is reproductive and other success is strongly related to snow depth and extent. And that's something that there's a clear climate change signal in. I don't know whether there are, I'd be interested to hear if there are any sort of overarching reviews looking at the major species in existence and say
one thing I might add is yeah, Dr. Josh Lawler at University of Washington is leading an interagency and cooperative effort. It's on a website called Pacific Northwest Vulnerability Assessment, and that is specifically related to species and habitats. And the work is ongoing. It was funded by a number of agencies, but also the landscape conservation cooperatives.
Yeah, so that's a great example because that is one that does attempt to look across multiple species and sort of look at their relative vulnerability relative to each other to these climate change drivers. And I think that has been what's been lacking in the past, and there's been more individual species by species look at what the implications of climate change might be that are also incredibly important but don't necessarily give us the tools to compare across them all.
Okay, well, it's 5 after, and I don't see any further new questions. So, Amy, I want to thank you for today's presentation. There's a lot of material to cover, and thank you for the extra time on the questions and answers.
Thank you very much for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
And
thank you, everyone, for joining. Appreciate that, and we will be posting this presentation on YouTube and sending a email out on that as soon as it's available. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.